Hey guys, in this video you're going to learn all about making pastel or crayon inspired stuff in Blender. It'll help you with not only making pastel inspired portraits like this one I made, but it'll also help you with making pastel inspired models in general. I've developed a bunch of cool techniques and will share them with you here. Just to outline this video a bit, in the first part I'll show you how I modeled the body and face, but that's actually the least important part when it comes to this style. The real meat of this video will start at 422 when we start doing the texturing, and it's at that point where you'll start to see the pastel effects come together. Before we get into it, one thing I'll say is I don't use any particular concept art to work off of, and rather I prefer to make my own unique things. So what I usually do is just doom scroll Pinterest and get inspiration from images I see while I make my model. So yeah, that's how I get my ideas for what to add and where to place things, etc. Anyways, let's get into it. I start off with a cube, which I subdivide with Ctrl 5 and apply the subdivision surface modifier. I then go into sculpt mode and flatten the sides of the head. To show you the anatomy of the side of the head a bit better, let's analyze Umi from Up on Poppy Hill. Basically, the line I'm drawing here is the jaw, and that circle is the jaw itself. If we then draw a line back, we have the ear, and from there, if you go above that, we have the flat side of the head that we just made. After that, I drag out the chin a little bit, and I also cut in an area for the jaw to head connection. Okay, let's analyze Marnie to understand the jaw to head connection a bit better. Basically, it'll go out from the chin and then sharply go up to the ear, and everything under there is going to be put in shadow because it's below the jaw. Next, I add in a cylinder to act as the neck and position it into place. Keep in mind that for girl characters, the neck is going to be on average smaller than that of male characters, and it'll generally line up with the eye. I also add a UV sphere and squash it a bit via scaling, and it's going to act as the ears. I mirror it across the x-axis and then go back to sculpt mode after that. For the face, I first cut in a cavity for the eyes and try and mark where I'm going to place the eyes later. I also dragged out the nose with the grab brush and cut in a slot for where I want the mouth to be. You should also keep in mind when making a girl character that relative to a male character, the eyes are generally bigger, the nose is generally smaller, the face is shorter in length, and also the lips are usually smaller. After that, it's just a lot more sculpting. There's not too much to really say here other than the fact that practice is what will make you better. What I'm drawing in right now is what the face should look like from a side view, so just be sure to keep this in mind. Over here, I extruded the eyes backward by masking out the eye, hitting Ctrl I to invert the mask, and then using the move tool to drag back the eye cavity. And yeah, after that, the face is mostly done. Once again, for making 2D looking portraits, your sculpt really doesn't have to be that great, and 85% of the work is going to be done in the texturing stage. Over here, I booleaned our ear objects into the head to fuse them, and from there I just sculpted in the ear. I usually leave the ears for last when I'm sculpting. When done with the head, I use the skin modifier to make the body separately. If you add a plane, you can go into edit mode and select all the vertices and hit M to merge them all at the center. The skin modifier works by basically forming geometry around vertices, so you can hit Alt Z to go to X-ray view and then start extruding out points. You should add a mirror modifier and a subdivision surface modifier as well. So as you can see here, I'm just forming the shape of the body with the skin modifier. Remember to use the mirror modifier as the first modifier in the stack so that you don't have any mirroring issues. You can easily extrude out the legs, the arms, and even the hands, and one of the cool things about this modifier is it makes it relatively easy to do all of this. When done blocking out the body, you can apply the skin modifier and then from there sculpt it into something more full. Of course, at this point it's good to be looking at reference so that you can make everything look accurate. For the feet, I recommend watching this video. It's great and explains a lot about how the feet can be sculpted easily. So yeah, shout out to In The Round. It's made with clay, but it's not too different from Blender. Once done with sculpting the body, I boolean the head and body together to join them. I also then sculpt in the clavicle area. After being done with all the sculpting, we have to retopologize everything. This can take a while, but my advice is to start out with the head of the character and then move out from there. You need to be looking at topology references, especially if you're new to Retopology. There's a million amazing topology references if you go on Pinterest or even just Google, so check out there. And here's what mine looked like in the end. Remember, it doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be relatively decent for what we're doing here. You also have to give your model a basic UV unwrap. One thing I'll say here is try to make sure you give the face as much resolution as possible, meaning that in the UV editing tab, the island for the face unwrap should be the biggest, because we want to have as much detail as possible that we're going to be able to add to the face. But yeah, generally for unwrapping, try to make sure that you add your seams in areas that are less noticeable, like around the armpits and the back, and yeah, just within those cavities. With all that being done, it's time to do the texturing. The first thing I'm going to do is head into rendered view, create a new material, and then delete the principled BSDF and add an RGB node. This will allow us to determine our base skin color, so you can set it to like a beige-ish type of color. Regarding the outline you see on the character, the way to add that is if you go to the modifiers tab, you can add a solidify modifier, set offset to 1, turn off fill, turn on flip, and set material offset to -100. And if you go to the materials tab, you can add a new material. Make sure you hit the arrow button to put it on top of the material stack. And basically for this material, you want to just have it as like a black RGB node. And then you can rename the material to be like solidify, or you can call it whatever you want, pretty much doesn't matter. You also want to make sure that you enable backface culling in the settings of the material. And then from there, if you play around with the solidify modifier, you can make it thinner or thicker. So yeah, also if you want to make certain parts of the model not have the outline, you can do that using vertex groups. If you create a new vertex group, and you can call it whatever you want, I just call it solidify here, you can basically select certain faces or vertices, and then you hit the assign button to assign those vertices to the group. And then in the vertex group option for the solidify modifier, you can then type in that group there, and then you'll be able to hide certain areas if that's what you want to do. The next thing I want to do is add a sphere, which we're going to use as the eyeballs. It should roughly be the size of the chin, and you want to position it into the eye socket. You can always change the size later, so don't worry about getting it perfect for now. You should also add a mirror modifier to the eyeball and select your body as the mirror object, so it'll mirror perfectly into the right eye socket. The next thing I always do is add a material for the eyeball. I once again add an RGB node, and this time I use a white eye sclera color. To make eyelashes, what I then do is select a chain of vertices going along the top of the eye. I hit Shift D and then right click immediately to keep it in place. And then I hit P and select by selection to separate it as its own object. Then go to the object panel, go to mesh, and hit convert to curve. What this will do is it'll make that string of vertices that we separated as its own curve. So we can then go into the curves panel on the right hand side of the screen, go to the geometry drop down menu, and if we increase the bevel depth option, we can thicken it. You can also thicken it by hitting tab to go into edit mode and then using Alt S on your keyboard. Also remember to mirror that eyelash object as well. So you can play around with different points on the curve and adjust the size accordingly using Alt S. Next, if you go into edit mode on the eyeball and you select a circle in the middle, you can add a new material slot and hit assign with that circle selected, and that way we now have two materials for the eye. We have one for the sclera part, or the white part, and one for the cornea, which is the dark part of the eye. What I now want to introduce you to is the process for painting anything on the skin. I first add an image texture, I hit new, and for this it'll be for the black colors that we draw in the body, so I'll call them blacks. And I usually use an image resolution of 4096 by 4096. If we then drag out a mix node, we can plug the image texture into the FAC and set the B value to be whatever colors we want to draw. This works because since we plugged in the image texture into the FAC, the image texture becomes a mask. Basically, the dark places in the image texture correspond to the A value, whereas the whiter places in the image texture will correspond to whatever we set as the B value. Naturally, the image texture is set to black by default, meaning that when we draw with white on it, wherever we draw white will end up being black on the skin because we have black assigned in the B slot. So as you can see, using that image texture, I just draw in the fold for the skin above the eye. I then create another image texture, and this one is basically to darken areas of the face. This time I use a hue saturation value node in the B slot, which will allow us to basically just use an adjusted version of whatever we have previously as the B value. This means that, for example, if we decrease the value on the hue saturation value node, then wherever we draw will be a darkened version of whatever we had before. So here I drew some darkness to mark where I wanted the eyebrows. I then set up yet another image texture, this time to add red areas of the face. I'm sure you're starting to get the hang of this at this point. It's a repetitive process. So yeah, you can just add redness to the lips and blushy areas of the face, as I did here. You can also add some darkness around the eye areas as well. Next, I actually ended up undoing this step, but here what I did was I added a path curve, scaled it down a bit, set it to black in its material, and started to position it where the eyebrows would be. I ended up undoing this in favor of just drawing in the eyebrows on our black's image texture. So you can kind of just ignore this part, but keep in mind the way that I made the path curves because it's about to come up again. Alright, so I forgot to record a little here, so I'll explain to you all the changes that I made to get to this point. First off, if we grayscale this, you can see that I darkened the lips area as well as under the nose and on the side of the nose. Keep in mind I used the dark areas layer that I made earlier to do that, and just use texture painting as we've been doing this whole time to add those changes. I also added more darkness around the eye area, and using the blacks layer, I drew in the nostrils over here to make them pitch black. Regarding the eyelashes, I simply used more path curves, and I already showed you how to do that with the eyebrows step that I undid. So yeah, it's the exact same thing. Over here I'm just showing you how you can add your first eyelash. and one layer you're going to want to position at the bottom part of the eye, almost as if it's like hanging off. So after you're done with the bottom ones, what you can do is position them around this big main eyelash that we made and vary their size and shape. I also added an object here to add the fatty area towards the left side of the eye. Basically the shape looks like this. It's just basic modeling. I mean, you can literally just model like a blob. It's nothing difficult at all. And at this stage you can set it to some sort of pink or purple color if you want. If I then zoom in a little, you'll see I added some transparency to the eyelash. I only added a little, but the way you do that is by dragging out a mix shader node and then adding a transparent BSDF so you can slide it to however transparent you want in the FAC option. I should also say, remember to enable alpha blend in the end panel on the right hand side over here. In the end, I didn't really make it that transparent at all, so I really don't even recommend you make it like very transparent. Another change I made was I added these highlights to the skin here. This was exactly the same process as all of the other image textures we made so far in this video. The only difference is that for the B value in the mix node, I used a very bright white color. So yeah, I added these highlights to the cheekbone areas, around the nose, and near the fatty area of the eye. What I want to do now is draw in some shadows for the eyeballs. As you can see down here, I have this image texture that I made, and the way I made it is no different than the way I showed you to make all of the other image textures for the skin in this video. And I called it texture eye darks because the purpose of it is going to be to draw in the dark areas for the eyes. So as you can see there, what I did was plugged in the hue saturation value into the B slot of the mix node and decreased the value, and now we can texture paint. So you can just make it a little darker under the eyelids area. That's what I recommend. I should also mention I did a similar thing for the cornea as well to make the bottom brighter. Keep in mind, if you want to access the material for the cornea, you made it earlier when you added a new texture slot and assign it to the circle in the center of the eyeball. So with the cornea material selected, you can see here I have yet another image texture that I made. This time it's called cornea. Sorry for the low res here, but basically the setup is exactly the same as everything else we've done, except this time for the B value I used a white color so that when we draw it's going to be white and we can basically lighten certain areas. You also might be wondering about this highlight that I added for the eye. It's an extremely basic thing though. It's literally just a circle that I added that has an RGB node that's white, and I basically placed it over the eye. I also added these nodes here. Basically what it is we can use the layer weight node to give our model a sort of crispiness around its edges. If we inspect what the layer weight node does, it basically creates a mask that goes around the sides of our model, and I use the color ramp node after that, which allows you to clamp the values a bit so that they're less smooth. And of course this hue saturation value node with its value set to 0 here is what makes it so that on these white parts of the layer weight node the model becomes darker. However, there's certain areas you may want to remove from this layer weight node, like the sides of the nose here for example, so that those areas don't become darker. To do this, we can add another image texture, call it layer weight mask, switch the default color from black to white. From there you can drag out a mix node, which we're eventually going to change to multiply, but you basically want to combine it with the layer weight node that we have. So the image texture is in one slot and the layer weight node is in the other slot of the mix. You won't see any changes immediately, and that's because since our image texture is white and white is equal to 1, the layer weight mask is just being multiplied by 1 everywhere, and thus there are no changes yet. If we then go to our layer weight mask texture and switch to texture paint mode and switch the texture paint color to black and we draw, we can get rid of certain areas from the layer weight crispiness thing. So eventually via texture painting I got to the point where my face looked like this. You'll notice I toned down the strength of the highlights and moved them more towards the center of the face. I also added some brightness to the plump part of the lips that's in the center. Not only that, but I added some highlights above the eyes, and using the darkness layer I painted in a spot for the philtrum. I also decreased the darkness of the lips a bit and desaturated it by removing some of the red that I previously drew there on the red's image texture. I also increased the size of some of the eyelashes that were just on the bottom of the eye, as you can see here. And of course I used Alt S to do that because they are path curves. I later also increased the overall strength of the highlights by increasing the brightness of the B value here in the mix node associated with the highlights image texture. And I also darkened the area around where the eye sockets meet the nose bridge to make it a bit smoother. The next important step is to add some darkness to the neck. You can do this using the dark areas image texture we made earlier. Over here I had another image texture I called dark reds, but it's pretty much exactly the same as the dark areas image texture that we made earlier, so just ignore it. Over here I set my brush strength to be at the maximum because I wanted my brush to be more like a dry erase marker, and set the texture paint color to be a gray rather than a white, so that when I draw with maximum strength, what I draw isn't completely dark but rather something less harsh. What I then did was outline the jaw of our character. You may want to look at reference while doing this part so you can see what the jawline looks like and better capture that in your own painting here. After you draw it initially, you can then clean it up by zooming in and trimming it to make it smoother. After you're done with that, what I then want you guys to do is go on the internet and search for some pastel or crayon style image image textures. I ended up using these two mainly in my project. With the texture downloaded, add an image texture and open up one of the textures that you just downloaded using the open button. It doesn't really matter which one you use for now, we just want to kind of set up the nodes a bit. You may realize here as well that this image texture that you're seeing on the screen right now isn't the same one as the two that I showed you earlier. And the reason why is because this is a different one that I tested first, but I didn't really think it looked good, so I'll end up switching it to the two that I had before later. So hit Ctrl T with the texture selected to add the mapping and texture coordinate nodes, and I recommend plugging in the window option from the texture coordinate node into the vector option in the mapping node. The window option will give us this parallax effect where wherever we move the camera, the image texture will follow. You can then use a mix node to combine it with all of our previous nodes, and you can switch it from mix to soft light. I originally used soft light, but I actually later ended up switching it to multiply because I thought it looked better, but I'll walk you through that later. You can also use an RGB curves node whenever you want, like I'm doing here, and basically that'll just allow you to make some value adjustments on the fly. I also selected all of the nodes associated with the crayon texture thing and hit Ctrl G to put them in their own group. This is an optional step, so if it confuses you, you don't have to do it, but basically putting nodes in a group allows them to be like a reusable component, so if we wanted to use those nodes again in another material, we could just add the group for it rather than copying and pasting all of the nodes. Although as you'll see later, I forgot that I actually put it in a group and I did copy and paste all the nodes, so yeah. After that being done, I decided it was time to change the background material. You can switch from object to the world tab in the panel here, which lets us edit the scene background. If you add a light path node and a mix shader, we can use the is camera ray output on the light path node to differentiate between scene objects and the scene background. As you can see, if we inspect the is camera ray output, it sets our character to black and the background to white, so if we plug in an RGB node into the second shader input in the mix shader, we can set the background color to whatever we want without affecting the character at all. So I set it to a white color, and after that I plug in the default background shader node back into the first slot of the mix shader, which is what we had originally. And actually we don't have any physically based shading on our model, we don't have any lighting or anything like that, so you can't even tell the difference when I plug it in versus without, but yeah. I made a quick little detour here to the cornea, and I decided to plug in the multiply node from our crayon texture onto the materials for the eye. So as you can see, what I did was I just copy and pasted the crayon texture nodes that I showed you how to make earlier for the skin, and then connected them up here. And we're gonna have to do this later for all of our other objects as well, but I'm just showing you the process here. It's nothing complicated at all, and yeah. Okay, anyways, after that I went back to our background material, and what I did was I added a gradient texture, and I switched its type from linear to quadratic sphere. Once again, check out my master stylized animated water in 3D video if you want to see more in-depth information about how gradients work, especially the first like 2 to 3 minutes of that video. But basically the reason here that I added this was because I wanted to have a sort of redness that we're going to add to a certain area in the background to make it less plain white. We want to have some color variation. So I'm basically just constructing a sphere gradient and just visually moving it into place however I like. And I added a map range node as well after that to clamp the values a bit, and this is all just according to your visual taste and however you want it to look, so you don't have to get it exactly like I'm doing here. I also added a mix node in between the mapping gradient and the texture node to displace it a little bit, and that's something I explain once again more in depth in the first 3 minutes of my master stylized animated water video that I was just talking about, so be sure to check that out if you don't understand how this works. Moving away from the gradient texture for a second, I copy and pasted once again the nodes for the crayon texture and mixed it with the base white color we had so that it would be incorporated into the background. What I then did was I dragged out a mix node and plugged our gradient into the back of that mix node and set the B value to a red color. So then as a result, the area of the background where the gradient is becomes more red. That being done, I decided it was time to move on to the hair for now. So to add the hair, we can add a path curve like usual, but this time you also have to do Shift A, go to the curve option and select circle. So you're adding a curved circle is what you're doing there, and for this circle, I recommend changing its resolution in the resolution tab down to 4 so it's not so hard on your PC, and then scaling down the points on the circle so that it becomes a diamond or oval like shape. You should then go to the curve panel on the right hand side of the screen, and with the path curve selected, change the bevel object to be that circle that we made, and then it'll use it as its profile. To start the material for a hair curve, you can once again start with a simple RGB node. I recommend hitting Ctrl G to put it into a group, and you're about to see why. What we want to do now is make a hair layer for our skin material, so drag out a mix node and add in the hair group that we just made that holds the hair's base color, and plug that into the B slot. So since it's in a group, if we make any changes to anything in that group, it'll update both on the skin material and in the hair curve materials. So now make an image texture, and I called mine hair switch, but you can just call it hair if you want, and plug it into the fact. So now it's pretty cool because when we draw with that image texture, we'll get whatever color we have set as the hair RGB color. So the reason why it's gray rather than the full brown that we have set is because I'm using the texture paint brush at a low strength, and so it's only giving us a small amount of that brown hair color we have set when I draw. And that's by design because we're going to add more and more later and just like build it up gradually to that brown color. But yeah, just faintly texture paint in an area for the scalp is what I'd recommend for now, and we'll build it up more later. After that, we want to add some transparency to our hair. You can add in a mixed shader node, and like we did before with the eyelashes, you can add a transparent BSDF so that we can blend between the two. You can then for a while just work on placing your hair curves into place, and it's pretty cool honestly to see your piece start to come to life at this stage, as now we have both the face and the hair coming into fruition. I wanted to make her hairstyle to be sort of like falling on both sides and have a bun in the back, so that's the type of hairstyle that I was going for, but feel free to do whatever type of hairstyle you want. It's really important that you actually enjoy what you're making to ensure that you create an actual good result. You can also add mirror modifiers to your hair curve objects like I did here, and so then they'll reflect across the other side of your model seamlessly. At this point, I reduced the transparency of the hair because I wanted to kind of just get an idea of what it looks like overall without any transparency, and wanted to add some changes. One thing we have to do is paste in the crayon texture nodes once again, and you can play around with how the texture looks with the mapping node sliders. I'm not going to connect it up with the rest of the nodes just yet, and so I left it unconnected for now. But basically, going back to our skin material, using the hair switch image texture, you can now start filling in these areas that are too bright, and as I said before, we're building up the hair over time and making it more and more filled out as we go. Going back to the hair curve material, you can see that I have my crayon texture here that I'm viewing right now. I switched it out from the earlier one I was showing you guys because I thought that this one just looked better. I switched the mix node we had earlier from multiply to screen so that now the dark hair is adding this crayon texture to it rather than multiplying, because multiplying with an already dark hair color just wouldn't really work that well or be obvious to the eye. The next step is very interesting. So basically you want to paste in the pastel or crayon texture once again, and the whole idea now is we're basically going to use it as a mask for the transparency of the hair. Think about it like this: the crayon texture has black and white areas, but if we plug it into the FAC of our mix shader, that means that certain areas will become more transparent than others and certain areas will be less transparent than others based on what the crayon texture or pastel texture looks like. So this creates a nice pastel transparency effect. I guess that's the term that I'm going to coin it. But yeah, so then we can use a color ramp node after that to clamp things a bit, and you can use an add node as well to skew how transparent we want everything to be overall. So yeah, just play around with those sliders and keep it as transparent as you like. From there, I continued on as usual, duplicating around hair curves and filling everything out more. As you can see, I had some open areas on the back of the head, so I just kept on duplicating curves to fill in those areas, as well as texture painting on our hair switch layer. The next thing I wanted to do was add the bun on the back of the head for her hair. So over here, you can see I basically took a curve and bent it into a circular type of shape. You just want to get it to look accurate and more close to whatever type of hairstyle you're going for. If at any point you think that certain curves are too transparent, you can duplicate a curve on top of itself, which will result in that curve appearing more opaque without actually having to change the material at all. I also added some more curves this time, a lot thinner, around the back of the head, and just sort of orbiting around the hair in different areas, I guess you could say, because in reality there's a lot of frizz around the hair, and to make it more realistic it's good to add that. You also may notice some of these orbiting hair curves have this hair underscore more transparent material. What that is it's literally exactly the same material as the rest of the hair curves, except I increased the transparency on it because I didn't want the thinner hair curves orbiting the head to be so opaque. As you can see here, I went back to the face and I'm playing around with the RGB curves nodes a bit to try and get everything to be a color slash value that I like. So focusing on the face a bit more here, I darkened the areas around the eyes a lot more as well, and I increased the brightness of the bottom of the cornea, and I also made the lips a bit more glossy by adding these little highlight objects here. They're literally just these like small planes with a white RGB node, so it's nothing too crazy, and I also concentrated the saturation of the lips more towards the center. So yeah, and I also added some freckles to her face too, but that's optional. Another change I made was I added a wave texture, this time using UV mapping so it follows the UVs of the hair curves, and basically I used a mix node to combine it with the crayon texture we were using before. And the reason why I did this was because the wave texture gives us these thin lines that look like hair, so if we break up the crayon texture with these thin lines, it'll look a bit more realistic. Keep in mind I used the overlay option here on the mix node, and to be honest it was just a trial and error as to why I used overlay. There wasn't really any specific reason. The next step may seem a bit more involved, but let me explain it a bit first. Basically the crayon texture we're using with the screen node at the beginning here with our base hair color is a bit too tiled. It just keeps repeating over and over again and doesn't look very creative. So what we can do is using a Voronoi texture we can displace the coordinates of the crayon texture so that certain chunks of it will be slid in random directions. Think of it like we're turning the crayon texture into a messed up jigsaw puzzle. So the way we can implement this in practice is by first using a combine XYZ node, which you can just paste in the same exact coordinate settings you had before in the location slot of the mapping node, because combine XYZ is basically the same exact thing. And then use a vector math add node and use the color output of the Voronoi texture as what we're going to add. The reason this works is because Blender will automatically convert the RGB color of each tile in the Voronoi texture to a XYZ value, and then so these coordinates will get displaced based on that. So now everything will look a lot more seamless. You'll notice in my piece here I used a noise texture by accident, but just ignore that, I switched it to Voronoi later. Anyways, moving on, I also started texture painting the ears a little, and when doing the ears, add darkness in the areas around the Y shape of the ear and also the inner cavity of the ear, and you could also make the top of the ear a bit more red than the bottom. Okay guys, so I want to talk a little bit now about the solidify outline. So previously we had it as just a black RGB node, but what I did here was literally all you have to do is just copy over all of the exact same nodes from the hair curve material and paste it in for the solidify material. So we're basically just using the exact same material for the solidify outline as the hair curve. The only difference is you could get rid of the wave texture overlay thing that we added, and yeah, pretty much doing this will allow us to give us a crayon effect to the outline itself. Quick little detour again, one other thing is if you go to the render properties panel, you can go down to the color management tab and actually play with the RGB curves of the whole scene. So that's just a quick tip if you want to do that. Before we continue, I just want to say a lot of you guys think the reason you may be unable to make high quality models like this has something to do with your technical skill or shaders or something. The reality is that's not the case. The reason you may not be able to has everything to do with observational skill. Over on ukiyogirls.io, I teach both observation and technical skills in depth so that you can create your own custom awe-inspiring models. I'll show you step by step how to make this character portrait from scratch, as well as a rigged full body character version, including texturing the body and everything else. Not only that, but I'll show you the full process for making this koi pond model in animation, as well as the sunflower one, all from scratch once again. You'll learn about sculpting the body, texturing, and making custom shaders that give off that wow factor even if you don't have prior experience. As stated before, you'll also learn all about my observational methods, and I like to call them the layered method, and it's basically just a method I use to guarantee that my works come out high quality. The point here is to gear you up to be able to make your own incredible works without having to rely on tutorials or other people's art. I can guarantee you that it's never been easier to improve and master this style, and I mean, I basically reduced it down to a science over the years. Not to mention, you'll also be given access to our Discord community where I can give you direct help with your art needs or any questions you have. So if you want to fast track your learning, check out ukiyogirls.io. Alright, let's get back to the video. Anyways, let's take a break from the character for now and have ourselves some flower power. So to make the flowers, I start off with a plane and I hit Ctrl 2 immediately to subdivide it a bit, and then I just model it into the shape of a petal. I always add loop cuts to the center so I can scale in and out the center of it, and yeah, just get it into a good petal shape. You can then duplicate them around with Alt D so that they keep the same vertex data, and I then insetted the faces using the I key and drag down to give the petals some more depth or dimensionality. I also add a UV sphere that I scale down on the Z axis and place in the center, and that's going to be the flower base. I then add a path curve, and the point here is to add the follicles for the flowers. So just duplicate them around everywhere and taper them towards the ends with Alt S. Make sure to vary their directions, and you can also try varying their height and things like that as well. And yeah, like I said, just taper them off towards their ends. After being done with that, you can add a solidify modifier to give your petals some thickness. So you can select all the petals, shift click the one you added the modifier to last, and then hit Ctrl L to copy the modifiers onto all the petals. From there, we want to add the flower material, and so we can just start off with a basic RGB node, and I made mine a beige color. I also added a material for the follicles and used an RGB node. You can select all of the follicles and select the one you added the material to last, and then hit Ctrl L and link materials. I decided to also keep the color of the base the same as the follicles, so yeah, they're both this yellow-orange color. After that, I added some icospheres which I positioned at the end of every follicle. This is just a common thing in flowers, and I think it makes it look better, which is why I added it, but it's up to you. In order to easily snap the icospheres onto the follicles, use Shift S. Going back to the petal material, if you add a layer weight node, you can inspect the Fresnel option. Basically what it'll let us do is it'll let us add a crispiness to our edges of our model. I set the B value of the mix node to be red here, but I think I later changed it to dark red because it looked a bit nicer. You can also add a color ramp node afterwards to clamp the Fresnel output a little bit to make it more harsh. You can then add an image texture, and what we want to do is texture paint around the edges of our flower. Since our planes are a completely flat object, we don't have to do any actual unwrapping for them. But I recommend you go into the UV editing view and scale up the default unwrap so that we have more resolution to work with when texture painting. So I use a dark red color here to texture paint with, as the B value in the mix node. So yeah, I honestly just thought this would give it a way more authentic, handmade feeling. Now we want to add some color variation. I'm gonna add an empty sphere here, and it might be confusing at first as to why I'm doing that, but basically we're going to use a noise texture to add color variation, but we want it to be so that it's different for every flower. If we use an empty to drive the coordinates of the noise texture, that means when we duplicate our flowers around, each one will have a unique noise texture. So to do that, you can add a noise texture and switch its texture coordinate node to object and select the empty you made as the instant object at the bottom of the texture coordinate node. I set the B value of the mix node to red because I wanted to add some redness to the flower, and I then played around with the settings on the noise texture until I got something that I like. I would also recommend adding a map range node to clamp things. I then wanted to add in the paper or crayon texture or whatever I've been calling it over here. So you'll notice I used a new one, and that was just because I found another texture that I liked, so I decided to try it out. You'll notice this one was blue though, so I grayscaled it by using a math node, and honestly, just to save you guys some confusion, you can use just a color up node to grayscale things, and that's what I should have done here to make it clearer. But using a math add node and just adding 0 works as well. But yeah, here I used the soft light blend mode, and I thought it looked good. So yeah, that was the end of that. I also increased the background brightness in this file because since this is a different file from the one where the character is, I just wanted to get an idea of how it would look when we move it to our other file with the bright background. So from there I made some slight changes. One other important thing that I want to say is that I put the RGB node for the yellow base of the flower into a group like we did with the hair color, and the reason why I did this was because both the follicles and the base use the same color, so I didn't want to have to update both in order to change the color. Over here for the base of the flower, I decided to do the trick once again where we use the crayon texture as the FAC for the mix shader to add transparency. One thing you may notice though is I duplicated the base, and now there's 2 of them, one in the center which is opaque and one on the outsides which has the pastel transparency effect that we just applied to it. This will give it a nice look where the base of the flower seems like it's kind of transparent around its edges. Anyways, I also added a gradient for the petals going from the center so that we can make it look like the yellow from the base is diffusing into the petals. So as you can see here, I've shown you a lot of times already how to work with textures and mix nodes and stuff, so I'll assume you get the gist of it. You can also add a map range node to clamp things. For the B value, I used the yellow color we used for the flower base and follicles. You can also add noise to the gradient by using a mix node in between the mapping and gradient nodes, and once again that's something I discuss a bit more in the first 2 to 3 minutes of my water video. After that, we can add the pastel transparency effect, but this time for the petal material as well. So right now I'm on the material for the flower base, and you can see we already added the pastel transparency to here before. So what we can do is select all of the nodes associated with the pastel transparency effect, hit Ctrl G, and now we can easily just use this node group in the follicles and, more interestingly, the petals. And so basically all the objects in the flower are going to have this transparency group. If you go into the group, another interesting thing you can do is drag the location and scale options for the mapping node of the image texture into the input of the group, and what that lets us do is edit those values from outside the group. So it just makes things a bit easier. But yeah, so it's cool because now every object associated with our flower has that transparency node group, and so we can just adjust the transparency all at once. Another thing I did was added a displace modifier to the petal. I hit the new button to create a new texture and switched it to object coordinates mode, and I added an empty, and I set the object in the displace modifier to be that empty that I just added. I then go to the texture tab and switch it to clouds texture and play around a bit with some of the settings. The scale setting is the most important. Now the displacement of our flower petal will be based on the empty, and you can scale and move around the empty to affect the displacement. You should also copy the modifiers over to all the other petals so they all have the displacement now. So as you can see now, if we were to duplicate our flowers around, they'd all be very unique because of all the great work that we've put in up to this point to ensure variation. Finally, I also decided instead of using a plain RGB node as the base color for our petals, we could use a noise texture instead to add even more color variation. I used a color ramp to map the colors of the noise texture to be white and red. After that, I copied the flower object and pasted it into my character scene. You can move it into place a little, and one thing you really need to do is select all of the objects in the flower, shift click the flower base, and then hit Ctrl P and hit parent to object. Doing that will make it so that when you move the flower base, the whole flower will move with it, and just makes it a lot easier to move around. I ended up increasing the saturation of the reds in the petals by a lot because I thought that looked better, and I also used the distortion feature on the noise texture we have in the beginning because I thought it emulated the sort of pastel pastel marks. So yeah, after that, just keep duplicating flowers around. You can have some flowers in the back where you make them more transparent than the ones in the front to give our whole scene a sort of like fading pastel effect where it's like in the background everything becomes more faint. You'll have to hit the number button in the material tab and also on the group to make them a unique separate material so that when we make modifications it doesn't affect our other flowers in the front. It's hard for me to explain it in a concise manner, but if you look what I'm doing here, basically I'm just making sure all the petals share the same new material and all the follicles share the same new material and all of the icospheres do as well. So just think of it like this flower in the background has its own different set of materials from the one in the front. So yeah, after that you can just crank up the transparency on this flower and yeah, it looks pretty interesting. The next thing I did was added a mask modifier to my character, and what you'll want to do is create a new vertex group. Select all the faces you want to hide and hit assign for this new vertex group. You can then go back to the mask modifier and assign that group that you created, and now we'll just have the bust of our character. I also added leaves and branches, and this was a super easy process, and so I'll just show you the materials and model that I made for them because I've already showed you how to make a lot more complicated things in this video, and I'm sure you can make these if you made those. So all of the branches that I added are literally just a path curve. I've shown you how to make a path curve a lot of times in this video, so yeah, that's all it is. But if we look at the material now, it's extremely simple. All it is we have a noise texture to start out with instead of an RGB node, so we can give it some variation right off the bat, and then a map range to clamp things a little bit. After that, I ran it through a color ramp to decide the colors, so as you can see, I used a dark brown color and a light brown color. And then after that, we have the transparency node group that we already made before, and so that gives it its transparency. For the leaf, it's a similar thing, nothing too complicated. We literally just have, starting out, a noise texture, and I then use a color ramp to give it its values. As you can see, I used a light green and a dark green color here, and after that I also used a gradient texture which goes from the top to the bottom to basically just give it some sort of depth. And as you can see, this hue saturation value node makes it so that it's a bit more dark on the top than it is on the bottom. And yeah, after that I used an image texture as well that I drew on, and this was just for the leaf veins. If you look here, you can see the veins that I drew, and it's just a flat object, so you don't have to really unwrap it or anything. After that, I multiply by one of our pastel image textures. You could have used soft light here too, but I thought multiply looked good, so I just used that. And then finally, once again, we have our transparency node group. If we look at the modifiers, I just used a subdivision surface for the leaves and no modifiers for our branches. And that's basically it for the leaves and the branches. Completely simple, nothing too crazy at all. So yeah guys, with that, this model is basically done after I finished duplicating around enough flowers and branches and stuff, and just making some slight color adjustments to the face. After rendering, I used an iPhone filter on it as well, which made it a little warmer looking, so that was just a final touch I put. Anyways, I hope you learned a lot throughout this video, and check out my channel page for a lot of other cool 2D and 3D style art videos.